Call this meeting of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order. My name is John McGlennon. I chair the committee and represent the Virginia Association of Counties.
Good morning, Cindy Mester, City of Falls Church, and representing VML, and honor of serving as co-chair to a tenured chair, which I love and has done a great job.
Good morning, Kate Mattice with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Good morning, Noelle Pinkard with Hampton Roads Transit, and I believe I'm representing the VTA as well.
Well, there you go.
There we go.
And welcome to your first in-person meeting with
Thank
us.
you very much. I appreciate that.
And Brian.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Brian Booth. I'm with Blacksburg Transit. I'm representing DTAB.
Jen, do you
I'm Jen DeBrule. I'm the director of the Department of Rail and Public Transportation.
Looking very relaxed today.
Yes, it's been off for 4 days, for about another month.
Zach.
And Zach,
I'm Zach Trogdon. I'm with DRPT as the Chief of Public Transportation.
And Zach, would you go ahead and introduce staff members? Who
We're happy to let them introduce themselves, I guess. Yeah, we have a couple you all may not know as well, so. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Tiffany Dubinsky. I'm our Director of Transit Planning.
Good morning, Grant Sparks. I'm the Director of Statewide Transit Programs for DRPT. And good morning, I'm Alan Saunders, the Engineering Manager.
Good morning, I'm Jonathan Arnold. I'm a Junior Management Fellow here in the office.
Go next. Hello, everyone. My name is Jayla Parker. I'm the Communications and Public Relations Specialist.
I'm Dan Sonnenklaar. I'm a Statewide Transit Planning Manager.
I'm Evan Price. I'm a Data and Policy Specialist.
Thank you all very much for
We
being here
have
today.
Todd Horsley, I think our Nova, but he's online. I just was
Okay.
going to mention him, he wants to call him out, but I think Todd.
Well, we got an important in-person meeting today and a good opportunity for us to see where we are in our activities. And we have as our first order of business approval of the March 28th, 2024 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve or?
So moved.
Thank
How
How are you?
Not at all.
Not at all.
So moved.
Second.
Second, any discussion? Favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. And we're joined by Jim Dyke, a member of the committee as well. Thank you for being here.
Battling the parking machines.
That's right. I know. Asking for ads, actually, which is just.
I don't understand why the app never works. I gotta go find the machine.
I say we're going to begin our information today with a General Assembly update by Evan.
Podium, or am I staying seated?
You do whatever makes you happy.
I think the mic is over there, so staying seated might be the best. So,
You're in the ceiling now.
the
so
ceiling,
you're-
yeah, that's right.
you're on.
all right. So, good morning, members. Evan Price, as I said, Data and Policy Specialist. I'm going to provide a quick General Assembly update. Last meeting, Chief of External Affairs Andrew Wright provided the biggest update. Not much has changed since then, so I got a pretty quick presentation for you all. Biggest change that I'm going to note inside the presentation is there's an amendment to a bus shelter bill that we've been tracking. The only change there is that it goes from a 1-year sunset to a 3-year sunset. It's a pretty small change, so I don't think it warranted the entire slide. Starting out with a refresher, what happened this past session. General Assembly convened January, they adjourned March. Governor provided his actions on legislation through April. Coming up in May 13th to 15th will be a special session to adopt a compromise budget. The budget will be posted to the public on May 13th, allowing for 48 hours of a required public comment period. And then it should be adopted on the 15th to go into effect on July 1st. So, next slide, please. So it's a pretty busy session for the governor. I think this is a record for the most number of bills ever introduced. I don't know if it was a record for the most number of bills to get to the governor's desk, but it was quite a lot. 776 of the 2,284 bills were signed, 150 were amended, and then 153 bills were vetoed by the governor. That's a record not just for a single session, but for an entire governor's term. So that's a lot of stamping bills saying veto. And then another record, session for records, 233 amendments were made to the budget, which of course, that is all still in the air. We do not know exactly what will be in the compromise budget come May 15th. Next slide. One of the big debates this session was funding for WMATA or Metro. WMATA has a budget deficit. It's been well publicized, and providing Virginia's share of funding for that deficit has been a complicated journey. It's been tied up in various political debates that it's beyond my pay grade to understand. But in various versions of the budget, there were various funding levels, various requirements, various studies. And until we have a final pass budget, we don't know what Virginia's share of funding is going to be. But from the governor's introduced budget, which included no additional funding, to budget amendments, which included fully funding WMATA's ask, it has been quite the journey. And hopefully by May 15th, we'll have a final answer for what WMATA will receive. So, like I said, a very quick presentation. So just wrap up. Governor and the leaders of the money committees agreed to come to a compromise on the budget, which will be adopted in the special session May 15th. This compromise budget will be presented in the Assembly 13th. Again, exact details of what will be in this budget are to be determined. There's no word out on the street. I haven't seen anything in the news about what will be in this budget just yet, but it's right around the corner.
All of us are waiting with bated breath.
And then just a recap. Budget coming up, July 1st, new fiscal year begins, and then cycle begins again. General Assembly session will convene January 9th, 2025.
Thank you, Evan. Does anybody have any questions for Evan? Okay,
I was
great.
gonna say no questions, but comments, because there's gonna have to be a lot of work, and there already is a lot of work. Obviously, for local governments, it's a big issue not to have a state budget, but for the transit topic in general and Wilmot in particular, it's very concerning. So I thank everyone who's helping us work it.
Any other comments? So now we're going to the fiscal year 2025 merit operating assistance. Steps.
Yes, sir. I'll just start us off. We're going to basically provide you the conclusions, and then we're going to talk about what's behind some of those conclusions, and then we're going to tell you the conclusion again. And I think to say we're living and working in challenging times is something that's obvious to all of us, and so it's no different for what we've had to put together this year in terms of our program. And as Mester was just saying, it's challenging times at this level, regardless, just with everything trying to be out and compromised. So. You all were shown this, given this ahead of time, so we'll just kind of hit the highlights and get to our some discussion. We're not necessarily looking to get any decisions today, but we just need to set the groundwork for what we need to talk about moving forward. So, as you see, over the past several fiscal years, we've had some going to use the term one-time revenues as sort of the what we've been living with, and so it's been good. I was at an agency before. We have agency personnel here, and all of you work with locals and agencies, and so it was helpful. It was a lifeline. It was very good, and so, but we are returning to a time when that may not be as much available. So, in fiscal year 25, we are still going to see. We'll talk in a second about some detail about we are able to provide some funding above what it would have been according to formula. Some of those funding levels, and so. And then just again to remind you, that we are still putting stuff through the formula, so agencies are being allocated on that basis. And so we'll talk about what some agencies got and how it was impacted to get a little more into the details. And so, and to hit the point again, this will going into fiscal year 25. As we go into fiscal year 26, those one-time revenues are not guaranteed that have helped us. And so, we want to just talk a little bit about what those projections look like for fiscal year 26 moving forward through the 6-year program. And so we're going to be hitting a lot of the same themes with every slide as we go forward. So Jayla, you read the next one. So the figures for fiscal year 25, that first figure, what it would have been if we went by formula, basically we would have had 114 being spit out of the formula. We had about $3 million of what we call carryover, and we'll see that again in a second. So some of that just is what's basically left over from all the calculations we've done. So, however, as we told you last time, we were scrubbing, looking, shaking the proverbial couch cushions, as we say, which, as an agency, just making sure we have looked at all our revenue sources. And so we did identify about 10.5 million in one-time revenues from some project deallocations we were able to make, and we have recommended putting that back into the operating program specifically. And so, if you look at we put this code section here because, basically the spirit of the code seems to say that, hey, if there's a need to put some stuff into the operating assistance program to help stabilize it, then that is the spirit of the law as far as we read it. So we are recommending taking that 10.5 million we were able to find and locate and to put back into the operating program to help shore up that for this year, because we know that probably is the greatest need right now in terms of our agencies. And then that third bullet is just showing what we are basing, sort of this time lapse for stuff we have to we're basing our allocations on right now. We are really dealing with fiscal year 23. We'll kind of talk a little bit later about how in the last couple of years, still things have been changing a lot. So what does that mean for us moving forward? And then, we're going to talk a little bit about how the operating formula and allocations are capped at 30% agency. So that does protect our ability a little bit to spread it out and stabilize it. I think that was a TSDAC decision back in the day that you all came up with because you didn't need to see these wild swings and you wanted to make sure there was enough that you could spread it out amongst the state and amongst different types of agencies as well. So that seems to be working well. So any questions or comments so far?
I do have a question, Mr. Chair, if I could. With the reallocation, fantastic. That's awesome to have 10.5 million. Is that abnormally large, pretty typical? Because I would expect that there are de-obligations every year. Not that we want to see that, but I know that's just the nature of the business. Any sense of whether that 10.5 is unusually high or is it typical? Part of that is sort of how it plays into the future, right?
Yeah, I think that probably is high for what we'll be able to find. Yeah, it was a combination of some discretionary money that was found from the federal government that we were able to otherwise take state money and reallocate it. Okay. So that was something where we did have a lot of success the last couple of years in getting some federal money, and so that helped free up some state money. So yeah, I would say it is abnormally high. Yeah.
It's unfortunate for future years, but thank you.
Right, exactly. So yeah, exactly. Wouldn't guarantee, wouldn't expect it, but things can happen. But yeah, it was a nice find. Yeah.
Looks like follow up. Abnormally high, 50% high, 75%.
As you can see,
a bit of a.
It's about 10% if you take, if it was 111 million, 114 million. So you're in the 8 to 10% range, I think. So I would say, it is hard to say what a typical one would be, but I think just finding this amount of money from some, discretionary money we found is just something that I wouldn't expect to happen too often.
That's helpful because your first line, you had 3 million.
Right, of carryover. And see, so we'll get to that in a second too, about how some of this money's been carried over. It depends on the timing of when it comes into, VDOT and stuff like that it could, maybe there's not a chance to put it back in the program. So it's just carried over to the other year. So all those things, there's a little variety in it, but.
That seems more normal because there's always.
Correct. I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah. So I think a couple of million may be possible each year, but yeah, 10 million is something we did get intentional. We're going to put this back in the operating program because it is something that's been enabled by some, to use the word abnormal, maybe a little strange, but it's not going to be perennial, I guess, is the only other thing. So
really one time.
Great question. So here's where we show a little bit, and to say 10 million's abnormal, but yet we're showing 50 million and 48 million and stuff like that as some one-time type of revenues. But this is just to illustrate how over this extraordinary time that involves the pandemic and inflation and things like that, how it's affected our revenues. And so what we have had in addition to what will come out of the formula, that's if it's not clear, that's basically what this is showing. And so for this year, as you see, we had the 3 million, we've put another 10.5 in, and so that's where you get sort of this 14 million additional. to get us to what we're able to allocate this year. Now, hopefully I can say this correctly. Each of these years doesn't mean you can't add these up and say this is how much we got in additional funding necessarily. It's like I said, sometimes it's the timing. The $3 million, what we carried over last year might have been, an amount from other years. It's just it was still there because of timing. Potentially, we just didn't have a chance to put it into the program that year. So I think the takeaway is there were substantial one-time revenues. We basically have used them over the years, but those are obviously working their way out, as you can see here, working their way out very quickly. So those exact amounts, there was a lot, but that's one thing we can say. Any questions about this one? Is everything kind of clear? So again, just to illustrate how these are working their way through the system over the last several years.
I think this was the primary reason that we wanted to have this meeting today, because I think when we did the virtual meeting, we showed you a much lower number based on what was in the budget. These guys did a lot of work to sweep between the sofa cushions and figure out how to, get that number back up so that we didn't see big impacts across the board. And so, the extent to which we're going to be able to do that when we get back to a trajectory that is normal for the program, I think folks need to be prepared for that. Performance does come into play because we have some systems that are doing extraordinarily well, and we have others that are not. That then just kind of implies how those impacts are felt across the program. Not to steal your thunder of what comes next, but
oh no,
we'll walk through that. But
right.
I mean, really, this is just trying to kind of set the table for TSDAC to say, getting back to we've ridden that. I think I sat here and said, like, we're riding the cusp of a bubble for a couple of years. Like the bubble's now behind us, and so this is where we need to be. This isn't something that's attributable to pulling VRE out of the program. This was on its own trajectory, has nothing to do with that legislative change last year. This is just us getting back to where we should have been if we hadn't had the influx of all of the additional federal money, CTB directed money in 2022.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point. I think we in local government see that very much in terms of the way in which the COVID money has been working its way out of the system, where we were encouraged to create new positions in some instances that now, after 3 years, are kind of moving into the expectation that we will be finding the funding to cover those things. So it's not surprising that we're facing the situation, but it is pretty normal. This kind of abnormal circumstance, right?
So it definitely warranted getting everybody in the same room to kind of talk.
Right.
Yeah, great point. So the next slide, we're just breaking it down even further to just last year versus the upcoming year, just to kind of show you how the 128 million, has come about. And as Jen just mentioned, VRE, we took them out, but yet we've still been able to show up the program to provide, all the other agencies out there with this hopefully lifeline until we do get back to some normal things. We were seeing that there were going to be some substantial decreases. So we certainly felt that if we could find some one-time revenues, it was something to provide stability to the program. And so this is just another sort of a little closer illustration of that. And so, again, we say here that we're recommending this year, and we haven't heard any reason this wouldn't go through to include that extra allocation to the operating program. But there's just no guarantees moving forward that we'll have that type of funding, one-time funding again. So it'll be back to formula and what comes out of that. So without any more questions, Dan's gonna kind of lead us through some.
Can I just ask one question? That is, in terms of the sources of revenue that we do have, is there any kind of trend that we're seeing in terms of, are they flat? Are they declining? Are they increasing at any kind of rate?
My understanding is that given just, some of the gas tax receipts and stuff like that, I wouldn't say they're necessarily declining, but they're not really increasing at the rate they need to. And that's what we've seen.
Laura Farmer, who's VDOT CFO, did a briefing for the board this month, and she's looking at the overall Commonwealth Transportation Fund. So remember, in 2020, when we reset the program, we're all like, all of the fund sources go into one big Commonwealth Transportation Fund, so that those changes in different fund types are balanced across all modes and not just disproportionately on one or another. And so, you know, it loops so many different fund sources in there. It's much more stable than what we had before. And so I think it does show a little bit of growth. I think
Yeah.
everybody's a little, what I continue to hear is concerns about next year, and are we, like, where are we headed with the overall economy and how that would impact our revenues. But so I think they're a little bit conservative, but they're showing that we're kind of staying on that anticipated trajectory coming up.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair said, and so, I mean, it's fantastic that we actually were able to do the 2020 omnibus to be able to shore that up. But I think the other thing that's going to be underlying all of this is that we're talking about those, that's a revenue conversation. The actual cost of operating transit due to a huge number of labor related issues that are permeating the entire US economy, the cost of operating transit and how that connects with the revenues coming in, I think is a conversation that there needs to be a collective discussion about. I know we happen here on the metro side, but the reality is that's permeating anybody, whether they have collective bargaining or not, the cost of labor and how that's keeping up with the growth of revenue, I think is something that is going to exacerbate the dynamics that Zach and Jen were just talking about.
The cost of capital. Yeah.
The labor associated with capital too, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you think about the increase in buses, the cost of vehicles.
Inflation.
Yes, like our whole program looks way different than it did.
Yeah.
So, no other questions or comments? Dan will lead us through sort of just some of the details behind this, some of these.
Familiar
Conclusions.
series of charts coming up.
You all know our style. Thank you all for having me present here today. Over the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about the agency by agency specific allocations that we are seeing for this year. And then we're going to get into some information about how some of the dynamics of the formula are impacting this, just to dive deeper into some of those kind of levers that get pulled up and down for an individual agency's allocation. So these next two slides illustrate those actual allocations as you've seen before. I'll just speak through all the colors in the chart to make sure everybody's on the same page here. First of all, this is just the upper two quartiles of agencies in the state. By upper two quartiles, it's the largest allocations of state revenues for operating. So this includes about 20 agencies, and the second one includes the other 20. For each of these slides, the dark blue bars here represent the FY25 recommended allocation. Lighter blue points, which are connected with the dotted line, represents the FY24 allocation. And the red dash marks above each of these indicate the 30% cap, or the maximum they could have received in FY25. In addition here, I have highlighted those agencies that are seeing a decline compared to last year with a red box around the name across the bottom. So that this will be consistent between these two slides and can kind of frame up how we look at these. And I am aware there is a lot of information in here, and you could spend time on each one of these bars individually, which we won't do. I'll just try to give you guys the large contours of what's going on here. So decreases and increases, for that matter, are a function of multiple factors that go into the formula that were mentioned on the previous slides. So this has to do with, of course, the total amount of funding in the operating program, which is the basis for which these allocations are made from. Changes in sizing metrics and performance trends for individual agencies compared to the rest of the state also influence those allocations. And of course, changes in the 30% cap based on spending can either go up or down depending on how much was spent in the previously reviewed or audited financial or fiscal. So we can see here that there's some agencies that are receiving significant increases compared to FY22. Those agencies, and I'll just go down the list here, are GRTC, which is seeing a 16% increase compared to last year, Dash 15%, Blacksburg Transit 20%, and Harrisonburg 10%. This also shows that there's agencies that are experiencing a decrease. HRT is receiving 7% less than last year. ART in Arlington is 15% less than last year. CAT 6% less. GLTC 8% less. Bay Aging 15% less. VRT 9% less, and FXBGO 3% less. Slide, please. And I'll stop after the next slide to discuss some of these. So this then represents the lower two quartiles, so the lower half of agencies receiving operating assistance from us. Please note here, and I always like to point this one out, that the y-axis on this chart has changed significantly. So the largest agency on this chart is smaller than the smallest on the previous. Okay, the other y-axis was set at 35 million. This is set at 1.2. So it's very different in scale. So 8 agencies on this graph are experiencing an increase. The most significant in percentage terms are Wintran with 20% increase, Blackstone Area Bus, 25% increase, Farmville with 16%, Greenville County with 15%, and the town of Alta Vista with a whopping 52% increase. Now, please note that's $16,000. So they have a very small operating budget, and so any kinds of fluxes in their spending can lead to a relatively large increase or decrease in that matter. 11 agencies on here are experiencing, unfortunately, a decrease. The most significant in terms of also percentages are Danville Transit System at 17% reduction, City of Suffolk at a 10% reduction, Radar at 9%, Bluefield at 10%, Bristol at 12%, and Pony Express at 33%. And again, they are also suffering from large fluctuations in percentages, but small dollar amounts. That 33% reduction was a difference of $6,000. So that's the contours of the program this year. And if you advance to the next slide, please, we see all of them laid out here on our scatter plot. And so just to get everybody on the same page here, any of the dots that represent agencies that appear on the top right of this represent increases, and the bottom left decreases. The vertical axis, the y-axis, represents the percentage, and the x-axis is the dollar amount. And so you can pretty much get the entire story here. The grand majority of our agencies are really within that 10% fluctuation, either up or down, and within about $250,000 up or down. And then you can really see the outliers jump out here. And so I will stop here and see if you all have any questions on specific allocations to agencies before getting into some of the more nitty-gritty dynamics of what's going on that's influencing this.
Any questions?
I have a question on the next one.
Yeah.
You guys have reviewed this slide. I'm sure you came with questions queued up. That's great. Okay. So I will go on to the next one. All right. So like I said, part of this presentation is illustrating how certain aspects of the performance-based formula impact these agency by agency allocations. And so here, over these next few slides, actually, I attempt to break down some of these elements included in the formula and show how they do impact those allocations. The graphics accompanying these next three graphs, or these next three slides rather, are illustrating a hypothetical agency A. Hypothetical agency A is not representative of any given agency. I just chose some metrics here that illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So if that was the question, okay. All right, so to start, to outline some of the impacts of the performance metrics, or these trends in performance metrics rather, which are used in tandem with sizing metrics. I just spelled out a few of these characteristics here. So the foundation of the allocation every year is the sizing metrics. And for that, we use a combination of operating costs at 50%, ridership at 30%, revenue hours at 10%, and revenue miles at 10%. So with the combination of all of these, we create what we call a size weight for each agency. And those size weights are then normalized across the state. So they all 39 of them, 8 of them, add up to 100%. Okay. And so each of those size weights essentially represent the relative size of all of these metrics combined and weighted compared to the rest of the state. So the size weight for hypothetical agency A here is set to 0.2. which represents a very large agency. This is based on sizing metrics alone, it would account for 20% of transit in the state. Okay, and so that's our basis for this illustration here. Any questions on this?
So I just have a question about the timing of the data for ridership revenue hours and miles. What's the window of time that is being used for this upcoming funding decision?
Great question. For FY25, we use the last audited financials and performance sizing metrics. And so it would be FY23 for operating costs, ridership hours, miles.
Okay, so it was ridership and revenue miles through June 30 last year. Just because we see ridership changing all the time, right? And so that's actually really good to know for a window of time in the performance of some of these systems.
Yes.
Maybe seeing some changes since then, they will play themselves out next year.
Right, so it's July 1 of 2022 through June 30th.
Perfect, thank you.
The other ones.
That's for FY25.
That is for the FY25 allocation. Yes.
The
It's
year
all
lag.
looking back.
Yep.
It's something I'll constantly remind this group of, is we're always looking back to make our funding decisions. Okay. Very well. Next slide, please. All right. So this gets a little bit complicated. I'll step through this in general terms, but this is really to illustrate how the trends, the performance trends, can impact how the allocations come out. So a trend factor for each performance metric, and we have 5 performance metrics in the formula, are identified using 4 years of data. It's a 3-year trend, so it's looking at the change over that period of time. The state average, which is on here represented by the darker blue lines, is set to 1.0 in this process. And this gets a little bit wonky with the math, but it's important to understand how this is used. So it's not saying that the state average is equal to 1 here. It's saying that we set whatever the state trend is to 1. So any of the other trends compared to that can show how the individual agency trends compare to the statewide average. Okay, so a trend line for each individual agency is compared to that average and is either above, equal to, or below that average. Now, one of the key things to keep in mind is that there's some direct relationship metrics and some indirect ones. The direct ones are passengers per revenue hour and passengers per revenue mile. And by direct relationship, I mean that it is advantageous for an agency to have a trend factor above 1 in those. It's essentially showing that those agencies have a growth rate that is above the state average. For the other 3, the cost metrics, cost per revenue hour, mile, and cost per passenger, it's indirect. So you want to actually see a lesser or a lower number than the state average, because it's showing that essentially costs per each of those are going down. So here for agency A, we've illustrated all 5 of these and how they compare to the statewide average. All of these are in the disadvantage, like in a disadvantageous direction or a negative direction. Passengers per revenue hour and mile, so those direct ones are below 1, 0.9 and 0.92 respectively. The cost per hour and cost per mile are at 1.06 and 1.8, and then the cost per passenger is at 1.1. So all of these are trending in the wrong direction. Okay, and it's just to kind of exaggerate the point on the next slide, which is that based on all of these, we would expect to have these metrics have a negative impact on an allocation. So if you could please advance. And that's exactly what this slide shows. Each of those trend factors is multiplied by the size weights essentially to create a hybrid size performance. Again, I know it's wonky, but in the case of agency A here, those performance trends that are going in the negative direction are all worse off than the state average and have a negative impact on the ultimate allocation that comes out. So here we can see that without performance adjustments, agency A would have received $21.3 million, and with the adjustments, they are only receiving $9, which is $1.4 million less. Okay, and so that's just an illustration of how those performance metrics actually get accounted for in this process. Sizing metrics are really important because they set the baseline, and performance metrics then tweak that baseline based on the trend that the agencies. So I'll pause there because I know I just threw a lot out there and it's very math based. But do you all have any questions?
This obviously can go, I'm sorry.
I just had a question about future forecasting and agencies using whatever, I guess, previous year's data to forecast what their revenues are going to be. How would you suggest they do that?
It's very hard to do that because everything is dynamic and compared to statewide trends. And so I think we recognize that it is difficult for agencies to have kind of predictability sometimes with this, but FXB goes FY26 allocation will be based on how their trends compared to all of the other agencies' trends statewide. And so the best I can say is to look at this year and then to take into account what we are projecting as far as total revenues in the system and make an assumption that you'll be performing similarly next year with a smaller amount of money or a larger amount of money, depending on what the projection is.
Can I add something
Please,
to that?
please.
So we talked about the performance data is, there's a lag because we're using these validated performance numbers because we're allocating money. On our data portal, we're publishing data in real time. And so you can go in there and look at your trend line and you can look at the trend line for statewide transit ridership. All of those metrics are getting updated in that portal. And so if you want to get kind of sophisticated in trying to project that, you can look and see where you are relative to your peers. And that's, as soon as we're getting that data and getting it cleaned up, it's going out there in that portal. So you can look at that to kind of see where you are.
And then my other question is related to those that are on the TRIP grant. And I think this will be the first next FY26 will be the first year where you have, maybe it's the first year where you have that group of folks dropping off that may return back to fares, which will impact their ridership. Does that mean how, I guess the process accounts for itself. So never mind.
It accounts for itself, but there is a delay in it. So next year, for example,
It'll be the
we'll be looking at
FY27.
FY24.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so then the real year that it would be reflected in the formula would be FY25, which would be for the FY27 average. And so there's a delay in a lot of this.
I guess I'm curious about the question of whether we see a sort of half agencies above and half below, or whether we're seeing the numbers being driven by some extremely strong or weak.
That's a great question, and I haven't done the analysis, and we can look into that. But looking at the numbers just across the board, there's a split of agencies that are above. There's not one or two in particular in here that are really pushing it in one direction. One of the reasons why an outlier wouldn't necessarily do that is because the performance metric trends aren't weighted compared on based on the size of the agency. So you could imagine where like one large agency has a particularly good trend that could weight that average up, but they are counted exactly the same as the small agencies when identifying the overall trends, the average trends. And so from what I've seen in here, I haven't seen one or two outliers really.
Okay, thank you.
But we could do the analysis to actually provide that data.
That's interesting. That was sort of what was in my mind because I was looking at the scatter chart and then trying to think about slide 17, your visual, which is very helpful for me, and trying to figure out what was impacting X, Y, or Z, high or low.
And so in some cases, these performance metrics are pushing some of those agencies in one direction or another, but there's other factors that are going into that as well. Part of that is the 30% cap. For multiple reasons, one that's a little bit counterintuitive, which we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, overall revenues in the program also make a big difference in those allocations. And so one could be performing just as well as they did last year, but still experience a decline because there's less in the program to essentially go around. I'll get to that in a moment.
I think that's where I like I love the scatter chart, but today I'm liking this slide 17 with the performance metrics because it's a great way to visualize the direct and indirect impact.
And so those performance metrics like that are probably the most useful on an agency by agency basis to know how much metrics are actually impacting their allocation.
And of course, that state average is moving, depending on what everybody
Every
is
year.
doing, sure.
Exactly.
That's the definition of a zero-sum game.
Yeah,
When-
yeah.
If one, if one goes up, another one's gonna go down.
Competition.
And I guess we sort of intentionally
for
made
bigger
this, we intentionally made this complex because it does sort of equalize, and a little challenging to maybe project, but there's a way that you could do an assessment for yourself, and it, performance was a important factor, so it's captured here. And I didn't say in the beginning, so I'm going to take the opportunity real quick to say thank you for all the information in advance. That's really helpful, as well as the graphs and charts.
Good. Excellent. All right. So I'll continue if that's okay. So, all right, already here. So, in addition to the sizing and performance metrics that set the baseline for the allocation, trends in statewide operating spending also impacts the allocations in the formula. This is partially due to its impact on the sizing metrics because 50% is generated from spending. But also, it influences how the 30% cap impacts those allocations. And so to understand that first, you got to understand how what Kate was getting to a moment ago, spending statewide and nationwide is impacting this. And so on the whole, operating costs have been increasing statewide, nationally as well. And there's a number of reasons for that. And so this chart actually illustrates audited expenses for all agencies between FY19 and 23, which are used as the basis for our formula run without VRE and commodity. Took them out of even the previous years, even though they were eligible. I took them out just so we had an apples to apples comparison. Again, I also stopped here at FY23 because that is the last year we have audited financials for. That's what we're using to base next year's allocations on. So costs have been increasing, according to this chart, every year, with the single biggest increase between FY22 and 23. There's a number of reasons for it that have been already mentioned in this meeting. Inflationary pressures across the board, across the entire economy, leading to higher costs for things like capital purchases and maintenance, but also labor. And the other 2 points here are really about labor. So that's also been leading to increases in staff pay to stay competitive, but also to keep pace with inflation, and collective bargaining agreements getting revised that are increasing pay, benefits, et cetera, across the board. So one thing to note here is we don't know what this chart looks like going forward. We can theorize that it will continue to go up, but how fast is still a question, because we do all of this looking back at the financials. And so our funding formula may not keep pace with that. And that was already mentioned in here. And it's something that I think this group should probably discuss as well. But as mentioned a moment ago, the increase in cost also has impacts on next year's allocations because spending in FY23 can either increase or decrease those 30% caps. So the next couple of slides attempt to illustrate how that actually comes to the So namely, this is due to the fact that when operating costs increase for one agency that performs well in the formula, not only impacts their allocation, it can have a big impact on the allocations going to the other agencies that are not performing as well. And this is because funds exceeding the 30% cap through the way our formula works are redistributed to other agencies that are not hitting their caps. Okay, so in these graphs here, more hypothetical agencies, A, B, C, and D, we're continuing with our illustration of these. In scenario 1, agency A, which is a high-performing agency doing well in the formula, whose sizing cap and performance metrics lead to a initial allocation here far higher than the 30% cap. So they received, through the funding formula, $7 million higher than their cap. So what happens after that is we take that $7 million and we redistribute it to the other agencies that didn't hit their cap, B, C, and D. And so with $7 million, we were able to give agency B $3 million, agency C BC rather $2.2 million, and agency D $1 million. If we go to the next slide with scenario 2, we're illustrating a hypothetical where agency A's spending increases, which also increases their 30% cap, or their maximum that they can receive through the formula. So with all else remaining equal, because it's the only way to really illustrate this, they capture a larger amount funding available, leaving less for redistribution. Right, so agency A would now receive $23 million with a 4% or $4 million remainder that gets distributed out to the other three agencies at lower levels, 1.7 to agency B, 1.2 to C, 1 to D. So all of this is to say, it's a complicated way of illustrating that when spending increases at an agency that performs well in the formula, they're able to capture a larger amount of the total revenue. And it doesn't get redistributed to those other agencies that are not hitting their own gaps. That's a key thing that's going on here when we see these shrinking revenues. For a couple of years, we were able to provide everything at 30% because we had so much in one-time revenue. As those come down, this dynamic gets a bit exaggerated in the formula. So I will also pause there for questions.
I guess one question that I would have is, does that lead to some consideration of whether that 30% is the right number?
It's a great question, and we reviewed that a little bit in our last review of the operating formula. And yeah, I mean, it could be some or a policy direction that this committee may want to explore as well. I don't have enough information to sit here and say that it should change in one direction or another, because when you do change that, there are winners and losers. But yes, it could be certainly something that can change.
Yes, thoughts about that? How does this go for them?
Exactly.
Did you have some thoughts about whether it should go up or down?
It's pretty charged issue, I think. I'd want to.
That's where it is.
Detailed information to.
Yeah, so if you set it to 25%, the agencies that are performing quite well in this would receive less than if they could receive 30.
Right.
But it maybe leads to more predictability and kind of equal allocations across the board, not equal, higher percentages for those agencies that are not performing.
I don't want to steal the thunder of like money's the last slide. Remember, the CTV policy requires that we revisit, that we as y'all revisit the program every 3 years. And so that year comes up next year.
Right. So it would certainly, it's the kind of thing that has a lot of implications. Obviously, one of those implications would be that it might have an impact on local government funding for our transit agencies as well. So wearing that.
Yeah, because
They
there's
go
like a
ahead.
balance between trying to reward
Yes.
or incentivize performance versus predictability,
Yeah.
which is a lot of the conversation we had.
So
So
I think, in response to Mr. Dyke's question, I think that there are a lot of issues we'd want to explore in that, including the idea that maybe it's important to as one option, think about how you can maintain that 30% as a level that still doesn't upset the apple cart too much. Versus
Sure, I think for me, having some more data analysis, and this is a good foundation, there'd have to be a strong argument for me to want to change 30%.
Mhm.
But part of that is when I'm looking at the scatter chart and the other things is what we're doing, creating the intent of improving performance. Or are we having unintended consequences because we're not allocating enough money to help a system improve their performance? We've been doing this since 2013, 14, and it doesn't get any easier
It does not.
unless we have money growing on trees.
And that's the key. Is when you have a lot of money, it's a lot easier.
And I think
I always
also,
laugh because the City of Falls Church is Tree City USA for 46 years. I keep wanting the CFO to plant some money trees.
I was just going to say it, and I would turn to Kate for this, and also the impact, I think, a little bit about the discussions that are going on next year about long-term funding Metro and whether or not some of that money that was previously sent to the locality is going to be counted or not counted or whatever. And because I noticed a couple of North Virginia jurisdictions were the ones who are the losers. I think you mentioned Alexandria and
So Art and I think is probably the greatest impact on here, looking at the allocations. there are plans with the jurisdictions of money that they had been saving from the last couple of years to be recapitalizing and doing operations on their system using local money moving forward. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
No.
Absolutely. But the other part is, folks know, I think it might have been touched on in the legislative update, is at least Northern Virginia, there may be others around the Commonwealth that are going to be looking at, there's a legislative study specifically focused on Northern Virginia, but I know there's probably a great deal of interest throughout the Commonwealth to be looking at effectively the long-term needs for public transit. And so what that study, which is SJ 28, what that will yield in terms of understanding what are this cost trajectory compared to the revenues that are available. I know there's probably others around the room that are very interested in exploring that as well. So I think all of these things are going to be happening in parallel as we look to TSDAC next year and sort of see how that plays out.
That's why I raised it when you alluded to the fact we're gonna have to look at that next year anyway.
Yep.
All this stuff is gonna be coming up at the same.
Sure. And one thing that I would say when we do look at it next year, just some level of analysis of what the agencies that have shown that growth have done. So did GRTC implement more for their BRT line that allowed them more capacity and cost? So they've got that cost. They would be scenario 2 to me. So, you know, you add more capacity to your BRT line, you increase your cost, but you're a winner because you're going to have more ridership. And it is a little kind of, and this is not the correct analogy, so I do apologize, but like No Child Left Behind, like you get money if they do well, but if they don't, you don't get any money and those kids just happen to disappear. And some transit agencies may have to contract because they don't get that state money. Not saying that's good or bad, but it's just something that has to be considered. Or one of the things that we're doing as a supplement to our TDP, and this is a good conversation I'll have with our consultant, is the benefit of going fare free as far as a cost, because here I know in 2027 we're going to get dinged if we go back to fares just because we're going to have less ridership. So there's a cost from the state that shows that our performance metrics have a cost to those, so that may influence some of our political leaders to continue to go fare free. Cost may be more if we try to go back to fares. So,
Point, Jamie, that balance sheet when you're looking at fares and what makes sense should also
include that. Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I think one thing that would be helpful, and I know you don't have the answer today, probably is specifically talking about the 30% cap, having an understanding of how many agencies hit that cap and how many, what's the dollar value that's redistributed, so we can sort of understand, is it $1 million that's being redistributed, or is it 10 million? I mean, that would be helpful to understand the scale. I think the other piece too that makes it difficult, we're still in a year where we've got that increased revenue, that 10.5 on the top, that's that one-time revenue side. I think we almost are a little premature in trying to make any discussion on the 30% cap, whether it's right or not. With that in mind.
So I can answer one of those questions right now. I can't answer the number that hit 30, although I can look at my spreadsheet here and try to figure it out if you give me a moment. But the number that was reallocated after hitting 30% this year was 2.7 million. Last year it was 9.5 million. And so last year, I mean, if you saw the chart that Zach had presented, where we had 133 last year, if you account for VRE, we had 126 million. This year, we actually have slightly higher, but people are still getting hit because of that redistribution going down. So 30% caps have come up for a lot of agencies, especially the bigger ones. And so they can capture more of the. So yeah, we can certainly look into and analyze that further.
Okay, it's about 2%.
2% of the overall program.
The overall program is redistributed roughly.
Yeah, depending on what you're basing it on. Yeah, if you
I'd be using the 129 that was recommended.
But if you go back, what was it, 2 years, Dan, everybody hit the cap. And we had money that we couldn't distribute because of the cap.
That's the carry, that's some of that
That's
carry.
some of that carry.
Right.
That's why.
If we could only have that problem again.
Yes.
And I was gonna say, I think the thing as we explore all this is, first of all, identifying, is there a problem that needs to be fixed? We have had last 3 years of all over the place, both phenomenal opportunities with revenue, but also we're all figuring out what our systems are looking like moving forward. This is just Kate talking. I want to caution blowing everything up in a year from now, because predictability is probably 80% of the dynamic that I think most of our transit systems would like. Obviously, if there is a problem, we should be seeking to fix it, but let's be mindful, is there a problem? And how big is the problem, right? And so we're going to obviously have a lot of conversations in the next year. But that's the lens that I'm probably going to come into, is if we have what we are calling a performance-based system. There was a lot of thought put into this over the last 3 and 6 years. Let's really explore, unintended consequences and other things like that. But, being cautious to not blow up everything to potentially end up something that adds less predictability to our systems, especially as they're doing these strategic plans and want to be thinking 10 years ahead.
Is there a problem with the formula, or is there a revenue issue? And so that's kind of, right, that's.
I think
There's definitely a cost issue. We know that. So I think we can have a conversation.
And by the way, it was 9 agencies this year that hit 30%.
9 out of
About a
40.
third. 40, yes. 9 out of 38.
Is there a floor?
There's no floor. We did explore that when we were reviewing our formula 2 years ago. We decided against that. There's a few reasons for that. I mean, it essentially props up the agencies that are not performing well here. But it also didn't lead to that big of a change because of the floors that we were looking at. If you set it to 15%, there was maybe 1 or 2 agencies that would ever fall below that. So you would have to essentially create 20% floor for it to be impacted. And at that point, we may not have enough revenues to guarantee everybody 20% every year. So it gets complicated very quickly.
it's definitely an expenditure issue. I think there is a revenue issue, so I'm glad, because we've got the gap. And so I'm glad that we're doing some of the studies, and it is such a continuum because you want to have the incentive for performance, but that predictability is vital, I think, too, because if we had the floor and then a very small system didn't get anything, we could be closing down what is vital to that community. So I think some of the predictability for me makes sense. It's similar to what we do in our pension world government. We do a 5-year smoothing on the revenues, and in essence, we're sort of doing that because we're looking back. Maybe it's because I was here from the beginning. I don't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Start over. A little gun shy.
Self-preservation there.
Some gentle review. Very important to do our 3-year review.
The post 2018, I mean, remember, this came out of the 2018 transit package that included metro funding. I mean, it was all
a lot going on.
A lot going on, and it was bipartisan. Gosh, what a concept. It was bipartisan. And I mean, I remember how much time this group put into crafting something that interjected more performance, interjected prioritization on the capital side, and still gave us some predictability. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to throw it.
Always worthy reviewing it.
And yes, always worthy of
compliance.
or unintended
The data and the
consequences.
analysis is helpful. But also, we've talked about this before, 2018. 2020.
Yeah.
We're still coming out of that, right? 'Cause we're
Yeah.
still using retro data.
Right, right.
And money is running out, so
I mean, we ran.
it may be premature to
We
be
ran the
talking
formula
the
for 2
3
years and held everybody's performance data pre-pandemic constant. And it was
Yes.
last year that we went back and started using current performance data. So we really aren't that far into.
Yeah. That's important to remind ourselves of.
Yeah, the performance data here is, and I'll just remind everybody, this is FY19, 21, 22, and 23. not 2020 because it was the heart of the pandemic year. We didn't have the financials to run all of these, and so we're still looking back to pre-pandemic for some of these performance figures, which is why on a couple slides back, you'll see that first data points on the performance data slide being much higher or lower than the following years because it was particularly different.
Yeah, one more comment. I think when I joined in 2022, I started in with that first review, and the statement was we've only ran this performance formula one time under normal circumstances. Fast forward 2.5 years now, we still haven't done it because we had inflated revenues. So it's still like we're not even in a normal environment. Yeah. So it's tough.
Yeah. Well, even the discomfort we had this year with some decreases was due to the inflated revenues in the past. I mean, we could have run normal formula on normal revenues this year, but it just the continued carryover, just nobody was ready for it. We didn't feel like they were, so that's why we to try to add some if we could.
I think it's important for us to have a pretty thorough look at all the implications so that if find up in a position of saying that, you know, their system can work very well, but needs more revenue to make it worthwhile, that we can justify that in relation to other options.
And if I could just to add to that, I think, again, all of this stuff, I think, as we look to funding needs, et cetera, a really a holistic view, because the other things we haven't even talked about is that there was a huge infusion of federal money, and that fits a role for a number of our agencies. There's dynamics in local governments and their ability, whether they can raise revenues or not. We're talking about the state aid here. We're talking about the cost of labor. There's a very need to have a very holistic approach to how transit is operated and funded. This is a really important part of it, but it's not isolated from the other dynamics that are at play. Sorry, not to make things super simple here, but like, I think that, but we need to be mindful of that, right? And so insofar that we talk about next year, TSDAC revisiting revenue needs, et cetera, we're probably going to need to be learning a lot about the other dynamics that are at play that affect the safe and effective, funding of our transit systems.
We haven't talked about capital yet.
Exactly. Great. Capital and operating, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There was one slide left. We already talked about a lot of the points that are made on this one also. But oh, thank you. So here, I mean, this is putting kind of bringing us out of the dynamics and getting into the conversation that you guys are already having without seeing this data. This takes what you all saw at the beginning of the last 6 years, this year of FY25, our projected revenues for the next 5 years. So actuals are on here from 19 to 25, and it's projected. This is also an illustration, one more time, that for the past 3 fiscal years, we've been supplemented with a substantial amount of one-time that are coming back down. In FY25, just a reminder here, VRE was removed from eligibility, but we are still able to keep our revenues above levels from last year with that happening. And as costs industry-wide are increasing, DRPT's operating allocations across the board may represent a smaller percentage of the overall revenues for each of the agencies going forward. What's really difficult to predict from any point going forward is the extent to which that will be the case. So, does that mean that for the past few minutes we've been offline?
Only a couple minutes. That's all right.
We solved all-
transit
Yeah.
Exactly, everything's been
So
solved.
everybody will just have to tune in next time to figure out.
Yeah.
And let me just parenthetically mention that shortly after we started, Jamie Jackson joined us. Jamie, see you.
So I guess before I get into capital, I will just repeat for those online, I think the biggest takeaway of that last operating slide, and I'm sorry for those in the room that this is repetitive. And I'm not sure when it shut off behind me, and so I'll just repeat this, that the major known takeaway here is for operating. So actually, Jayla, if you want to go back to this, is that agencies should expect overall revenues in this program to come down between this year and next year, which could lead to agency by agency allocations also coming down, especially for those that are experiencing decreases this year. Without the infusion of future one-time revenues into the program, what we see on the screen here is what is our best guess of what is coming in over the next 5 years. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody online heard that as well. And then we can move on. All right. So these next few slides just give a summary, as I mentioned, of what we are recommending for funding in our capital program for FY25. To start, I always like to show what we got as far as applications, to then show what we chose to fund through our prioritization process. So a total of $108 million in state capital funding was requested this year across 427 individually evaluated projects and assets. We always say projects and assets here because the SGR, the State of Good Repair Program, the methodology there is that we evaluate individual vehicles and replacement assets, whereas the minor enhancement and major expansion programs look at projects. So we got $108 million in request, but we had $90.8 million to distribute to this program. So next slide, please. The recommended, as illustrated here, similar to previous years, our FY25 recommended program is mostly focused on state of good repair. Within the SGR, or state of good repair project type, we're recommending funding 275 of the 300 applied for assets for replacements using $58 million in state funds. This was based on identifying those replacement assets that scored 55 or above in our scoring prioritization method. And that captures all assets that were applied for that exceeded 95% of their estimated service life or useful life. For vehicles, this was either age or mileage. Okay.
Share the screen with her.
Can you reshare the screen? Thank you.
All right. In the minor enhancement project type here, we are recommending funding 94 projects using $24 million in state funds. And the minor enhancement type includes projects that are both state of good repair and character, but can't be scored mathematically as SGR projects, and projects that are small expansions within the program. Within this project category, we use 12 points as the cutoff for those projects that are state of good repair in nature to really, or in character, to really target those state of good repair projects this year. And we set the cutoff at 29 points or higher for those that represent expansions. Finally, in the minor or the major expansion category, we chose to fund both projects that were applied for this year. But I will say that both of these projects, and I'll get into more details in a moment, were really state of good repair in character as well, because they're the wholesale replacement of entire facilities. So, yes, Brian, did you have a
question? Sorry, the point thresholds for each of them, are those set each year, or are they a standard that you have from year to year? Is that
they're set each year based on how much money we have, what was applied for. Between state of good repair and minor enhancements, we're always looking at a balance between the two programs also. So yeah, that's dynamic. Okay, so next slide, we're looking at a little bit of a deeper dive into the state of good repair program. So within our recommended projects, 95% of funding in this project category will be going, or 95% of funding rather, will be going to the replacement of revenue vehicles in FY25. We're also including funding for some vehicle rehabilitation projects, support vehicle replacements, and a few smaller projects that support facility improvements that did fit into the state of good repair scoring. Those projects that include the replacement of assets that have not yet met 95% of their useful life for either age or mileage, we're not funding. Next slide, please. So here we're getting a closer look into the minor enhancement program, which is always a more complicated kind of pie chart here, or donut chart. Here we are able to fund many more different project types just because of the way that the scoring works. The largest amount of state funding here, however, is going to revenue vehicle expansion project. That's 27% of the 24 million in this program. And so this is followed by facility improvements with operational impacts at 26%, equipment for operating support at 17, and system infrastructure at 14. The rest of the categories are highlighted in this chart here are all less than 10% of the funding being allocated in this program area. And that includes categories such as ITS and communications equipment, maintenance for vehicles, onboard safety equipment, vehicle rehab as well, capital finance strategies, customer facilities, and other equipment. And I will note here that customer facilities on this chart is a lower percentage than it has been in previous years because of what I'm going to present on in a couple of slides, which has to do with dual eligibility for capital projects in our TRIP program. And here, projects that did not get funded were equipment for administrative support that was purchasing new equipment, not replacing old, and facility improvements with non-operational commitments. Those were lower on the list and unfortunately weren't able to. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights the two major expansion projects that we did decide to fund. As I mentioned, they're both really state of good repair projects because they're replacing dated facilities with brand new ones. This included, first of all, the Williamsburg Area Transit Authority funding for their project to complete their Pocahontas Maintenance and Operations Facility. It's a $20 million project for which we're providing 1.9 in additional state funds.
That's an excellent project, actually.
Not that you had any influence over this.
I'm excited for you too, so.
The second one on the list is additional funding for the Shirlington Administrative and Maintenance Facility. This is a $96 million project of which we're providing about 12 over the next 2 years, split between 45 and 6.
Additional funding.
And again,
project.
and we had no role in this. All about the data.
Yeah, both of these projects are replacing existing facilities that are dated and upgrading them to modern standards. Slide.
If you want to get through this in about 10 minutes, it's about 11:30. Get through this last part and if we can get through this.
Yeah, do that. All right, so in 2023, the General Assembly passed legislation that expanded the project categories in our TRIP program, which has significantly expanded the types of projects that now have dual eligibility under both the Merit Capital and TRIP. So these next few slides get a little bit more into detail about how we utilize that dual eligibility to fund additional capital programs this year. So currently, TRIP has 4 categories. It's regional connectivity, zero and reduced fares, public safety, and passenger amenities and facilities. And the 3 on here that have red asterisks by them include project categories that are capital in character. And so they're really eligible for both programs. Next slide, please. So this slide, should have been dynamic. I apologize for that. This slide highlights what kinds of projects in each of those subcategories are capital and eligible for TRIP funding. So within the regional connectivity program, or sub area of the TRIP program, regional fare integration projects that include new fare boxes, mobile payment systems, NFC payment scanners and things along those lines are eligible for funding in TRIP. In the public safety category, the types of capital projects that are eligible include public safety equipment purchases such as lighting, cameras, emergency or help call buttons, or systems, intelligent transportation systems or ITS, designed to improve safety specifically, and the purchase of other equipment that directly improve safety for riders, operators, and other employees as well. This does not, however, include security vehicles or projects that would help with OSHA compliance within facilities. And in the passenger amenities and facilities category, there are a number of different kinds of capital purchases that qualify for TRIP funding now. And it really has to do with the installation of new transit stops and stations or the improvement to existing stops and stations. So this is, again, lighting, seating, shelters, trash receptacles, off-board ticketing, customer restrooms, things along those lines. It also includes the installation of bike racks or other multimodal infrastructure, improved signage and real-time information, ADA access improvements, and the construction or renovation of transit stations and transfer centers as well. And so with this, next slide, we were able to fund 31 projects that were submitted into the Merit Capital Program through TRIP. We evaluated them and funded them through TRIP. It accounted for, those 31 projects accounted for $17.4 million in state funds. And the types of projects are highlighted here in this chart. So the majority of them were passenger amenities projects. So this is, a lot of these were shelter programs, replacements of specific shelters, but also these larger programs that some of our Northern Virginia partners apply for on an annual basis. The second largest category was the regional connectivity category. We were able to fund some upgrades to fare boxes to maintain connectivity through a regional fare integration system. And then 7% of the funds here went to public safety projects. And there's some examples here. One of them that I'll highlight is the Water Transfer Center at Old Town Road. That is actually a project that came in as a major expansion application. We were able to fund through TRIP because of this dual eligibility. Again, as I mentioned, bus stop and shelter projects all over the state. We funded a GRTC access gate improvement under the safety program, transit center renovations for HRT at multiple locations, mobile ticketing upgrades, and lighting and camera upgrades at multiple agencies. So the next slide, and I think this is my last one, it is. This just illustrates how we were able to fund more projects with more money because of this dual eligibility. So if we were just to use the Merit Capital Program alone, we would have funded 427 assets or projects at $90.8 million. But with the dual eligibility, we were able to fund 408 projects at 108.2. So it's allowed us to fund other good projects throughout the state. It's been up to, I think, our agencies. So I'll pause there.
Is the match rate is different than TRIP?
So the match rates can be different for TRIP, but for these dual eligibility capital programs, we are keeping them in line with each other. So they're not competing.
Just one clarification with TRIP, is there still the percentage breakdown distribution between the different programs within TRIP?
So there is percentage breakdown between the programs. The regional breakdowns that were in there only impact, I believe, the regional connectivity and zero and reduced fare aspects of the program, but just regional connectivity. Thank you. So it's just the regional program.
And then there's sorry, it's changed like every year. So up to 25% can be used for zero fares. It's fair. And then I think up to 25% for transit stop safety. And then 50% has to be used for regional connectivity. And that is supposed to be distributed basis of population in some way. Yes. Yeah. Based on 100,000. Yeah.
Your average.
It is the most complex allocation process or code language that I've ever seen. So we've got some work, policy work, looking at, is there a way to improve that going?
And Mr. Chair, I have a question. So we talked at the very beginning about this bus stop legislation. We've got a lot of opportunities for bus shelters, which actually I'm really excited because that's a huge part of being able to have accessibility to transit. Is that legislation intended to potentially help these guys make that easier? I'll honest, I know that was all over the place and I kind of lost track where it landed. So that is to streamline. That's the goal of that legislation, is to streamline our ability for our folks to do bus stops, right?
Install, yeah.
Yes. So that's perfect timing then, right?
And on VDOT, yeah, VDOT, HRT's done a great job on locally maintained roads, over 500 shelter.
Let's see, most of ours are VDOT roads, so.
So
That's where
it'll
it's
help the,
supposed to
it'll help.
Most,
VDOT.
I said, most, not all.
VDOT
Most.
Falls Church, every corner.
I
You have
wanna- I
beautiful
wanna
bus
be
stops already. I'm just kidding.
Very clear, VDOT was not the problem.
No.
It was DGS. The brainchild for a lot of that's Alan. He's very modest and he is gonna smack me in the back of the head for saying that. But no, I think this window that we have over the next 3 years with this sunset provision, like we need to go show that we can get things done in this 3-year window so that that sunset can get pulled off of there. I jumped my gun on, but I think we've got the opportunity to do a mid-cycle grant application for TRIP, maybe focused on shelters this fall. Just because there's funding available, there's still funding in that program that
That's fantastic.
we
Well,
can work
I think getting the message out to our transit agencies that A, there's money available, and B, let's get it out quickly to show so that this 3-year, come that 3-year window, we can re-up it if we need to, right? The legislation.
Yeah,
Okay.
shelters, accessible shelters makes such a difference.
Oh, yeah.
Question.
Yes.
On slide 33, I know the program measures assets, so the numbers look great, but you know off the top of your head, like that roll into how many projects or how many systems? How many systems got capital?
How many systems got capital? Almost all of our systems apply for capital in a given year. Some of the small ones take a year off. They don't have capital needs. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I would venture to guess that it's 35, 39 agencies.
Yeah, because some of the larger agencies could have a lot of assets, so I was just trying to get a.
The larger agencies do get the lion's share
There.
of this. I mean, they apply for the most and they have the greatest needs. But yeah, it is spread out across all agencies.
That's working for all agencies and kind of aligned to where their needs.
I think the other takeaway though is we would have had $17 million that was funded by TRIP. So there's still, capital, the funding. There's still, again, we're coming out of large revenue, things to do with capital. And so we've found this opportunity, but the merit program, we still would have had,
And as we queue up for review next year, we'll probably have to look at those revenues as well to see if they're keeping pace with needs, which we do an analysis of every year on your capital budgeting process.
So if we were to compare slide 25 that had gray bars of unfunded assets, for example,
so yeah, that's the question.
then going to
That's the question.
That $100 million, you took out the TRIP project.
Yeah, we shifted them over. So there were still $20 million worth of capital projects that were not funded.
Okay,
So the real ask in the capital program was actually $17.5 billion higher than one.
that's what I was trying to.
Yes, I meant to ask me, yes, that's exactly. So there's still funding issues there that.
It's still a
Not as
revenue
disputed.
funding issue.
There is.
Capital or operating.
Well, and just going back to TRIP is a legislative program that's 6% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit account. Just, again, a holistic conversation. It's a carve out of a pie that exists. The pie has not necessarily gotten bigger, but we have a new program in the last couple of years. That may be great. I'm just saying that's 6%, that's 17 million that could have potentially been somewhere else in our program. Maybe,
So-
yes?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean-
Exactly. And it came online. Remember, it was part of the 2020 package.
Right.
Got passed and 2 weeks later, we all went home. And the whole vision of that program changed completely with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the regional piece of it has never really come to fruition for what it was envisioned to do. And I don't know that it ever will. And so I think TRIP has struggled to find an identity since the pandemic. And I feel like the systems have done a great job. Staff here has done a great job of trying to like figure out in the spirit of transit ridership incentive program, because that's what it's intended to do. Like, what else do you do to it to get there? And that's, we got the provision about the cap, 25% cap on zero fare, pulled off for a few years. And so we did more zero fare. Right? And now that's kind of run its course because the folks that are, wanted to try zero fare, they're in the pipeline now. Jamie's earlier one. And so then you add in bus shelters. And that was something that we saw as a need coming out of the HJ 542 study. So that got layered in, and then safety and security got layered in as government commitment. And so it's now this mishmash of unlike things that are carving out 6% of the program. And there's a lot of eligibility in other areas of the program, because the new services that come in under regional routes, they're also eligible for demo. And so there's a lot of dual eligibility, not just on the capital side. So, I mean, that may be something, that's something I know these guys are thinking about. So that may be something going forward that kind of can be used as a tool to balance all this out in a revenue neutral way.
Yep.
Somebody who doesn't do this on a day-to-day basis, can you give me some sense of the state of good repair part, where so much of it is on revenue vehicles? What kind of supply there is for those revenue vehicles these days? What the costs are doing, and maybe the mix between alternative fuel vehicles.
I can speak to a few of those points, but I may default to some other staff here to help out with this. Costs for vehicles across the board, we've experienced pretty large increases. According to our staff that work closely with vehicle procurement, is that the thought is that for some of the smaller vehicles that experience those very large increases, that has kind of plateaued, has gone back to normal inflationary increases instead of these extremely large increases that we saw between 22, 23, and 24. But as far as supply goes, I can't speak to that. I don't know if Grants, if you have information for that.
I can talk a little bit about at least battery and electric buses. I mean, also feel free to chime in, Brian, and others. And I know you're familiar with this issue, Brian. There aren't that many manufacturers of battery electric buses just in the country. And one of them not too long ago filed for bankruptcy. And so what's left is really just 2, maybe 3 OEMs that actually build these things. I've heard that the delivery time is still okay for these, but it's just there are not many manufacturers of them. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, Brian, you probably have much more information.
Yeah, I think the delivery time it's not come back to pre-pandemic levels, but it's come back to where it's reasonable. The smaller body on chassis now are somewhere around the 9-month from the time you place the order to receipt. And then the heavy duty buses are somewhere around that year time frame, give or take. So it's the delivery is much more palatable now.
At the worst point with the small body on chassis, it was 2 years. 2 years.
I've got fiscal year 21 money that I'm still trying to spend, and I've placed the order 3 times. So, and it's been canceled twice. So I'm finally going to get those vehicles in the next few weeks. But yeah, it's been a challenge keeping the old ones going long enough too. So, but yeah, it's getting back to normal.
And as far as the mix of electric in the program this year, there weren't that many applications for electric vehicles this round. Off the top of my head, I can find it between 2 and 5. I don't know if anybody else here calls off the top.
There's a lot of folks who are actually pursuing the federal money for that space. I mean, I think that in general, there's been some success in the Commonwealth with the low-no program. I know up in Virginia, we've had the benefit of that. So 85% cost share.
And we did a application through,
Yeah, we've done a CPRG.
for better electric.
Somebody else did.
Like 2 replacements are electric and 4 expansion vehicles this year are electric. We also fund CNG for some of our agencies that operate that. There is a mix of propulsion, but it's most of the large vehicles, it's still majority.
Still great.
I know that the cost of those pursuing federal money will certainly be a good strategy for agencies. Something they're double what a normal.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as more agencies transition to those low end, it's going to have an impact on revenues that are available. It's not gonna, the pot's not going to go as far.
Yeah, with some of the plans for electrification in the states, it will put additional pressure on our state capital program. We have relatively generous match rates that if a vehicle cost increases from 750 to 1.2 million, that puts more pressure on our programs, which is why we're encouraging a lot of agencies that haven't historically gone after federal funds to go after discretionary funds to offset that. Yeah, that will be something we're going to have to explore.
Can I make a shameless plug for some work that NVTC just did? We dove into the climate impacts of our transit network and found that our good old diesel buses are better, it's just as good for the environment until we get to about 80–85% of private fleets being electric. The diesel buses still roll even if you got 8–10 people on them when it comes to environmental benefits. I think that's something that we all can collectively talk about, is moving more people on transit, regardless of the technology, is still better for the climate while we figure out these things before we put a lot of money into new technologies. Just gonna put that out there. It's our climate impacts report. We just put it out just a couple weeks ago. So had to do that.
Well, I think that's a true fact, and I see it with all of our local government fleets. If you're running 1999 dump trucks, which we were, no emission control. So as soon as you buy a new dump truck,
It's still gonna be bad air. Yeah, that's
we're
right.
moving towards our greenhouse gas emission really quick. And I think even if you buy a new bus, that's
Yes.
diesel, it's a whole lot better than what was on. Get more people in.
It's more about getting people on the transit, regardless of the technology that's propelling that transit.
That's
It's
hard
a
message
lot more,
to
it's a
sell.
very hard message to sell. We all know that our elected officials are under a lot of pressure in this space, but if we can provide them good information to help them, that's what we need to do. So.
Well, I think we have one concluding slide here.
Yeah, if y'all want to forge on through, we'll get, so this speaks for itself. We just, it is by both certain part of the code and by CTV policy that this body view the program. So we just figure out how we're going to come up with a strategy, what we want to do for that over the next year or so. And come up with this recommendation. The last little, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but.
So you're talking about
Talk amongst yourselves.
this time next year,
Yeah.
you would start, and if it follows the pattern from 22, you would want to wrap it up, just kind of setting the stage.
Yeah,
You would want to wrap it up and take any policy changes, if any, to the CTV before the grant application cycle opened December 1st of 25. So just in order.
right, yeah. Oh, well, yeah. So we'll sketch all that, we'll have to sketch all that out.
Clear your calendars.
Is there anything else to discuss?
Just one other point. You mentioned the timing. There will be some activity going on in the Commonwealth next year that might add to looking at new approaches and new ideas. So I would urge those who are interested in perhaps looking at some renovation to maybe participate in that process.
So basically, once we get through with the warm up of 2024, we move on to the really significant election of 24.
Just throwing that out. Long-term planning.
assuming we survive the warm months.
Yeah, depending on how that comes out, we may all be living in bunkers next year. Who knows? We'll see.
So is there any other, we've gotten all the presentations, any other?
We have a
comments?
public hearing, so I know you're
Yes,
very well
right.
versed at opening and closing and doing whatever you do. Make sure that our legal, operations are.
So Jayla's are you gonna able to have people raise their hand or?
Yes, they should be able to.
There is one.
I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Anybody who wishes to speak? We put everybody to sleep? If not,
No, we have plenty of people
Plenty
online.
of people online. No one
No one has raised their hand.
asked to speak.
That great.
going once, going twice. Close the public hearing. Okay, that brings us down to our wrap up and next steps.
I mean, we can, come up with a schedule for everybody or something and put it out there and certainly just kind of come up with, discuss any information you all want. Again, if you, we can have virtual meetings as needed. We only have to meet, I think, in person once a year. So, yeah, perhaps coming up with a schedule is the best thing first. And like, as Jim was saying, really getting you like working back from when we need to have some decisions made.
You don't foresee the need for TSDAC to meet again this year. We fulfilled the.
Yeah, we fulfilled our
requirements
statutory duty. It would just be doing our work that we need to do to make sure that, any review gets in and work with our legislative team. Yeah, y'all's input in terms of your localities and your expertise is invaluable to do.
If it seems like there's some things that you'd like feedback on, I'm sure everybody would be happy to participate in probably in a virtual meeting somewhere in the fall before the General Assembly is going again.
It may, should we consider maybe doing a short virtual after we get a budget adopted to see if there's anything in there that impacts on
That's a great idea.
what we're doing?
Sure.
Evan, you got?
Sorry, any legislative updates?
I was gonna say, if there's anything that needs to be updated after we have a budget. Just if you can flag it, if there is, then we can just call this.
So we had a quick virtual meeting in August of last year. That's maybe after, if we want to have something before then, I'm certainly saying it's June, but June and July. Yeah, your budget's passed. Take a breath. So,
Maybe.
I don't know if August is, too long from then or.
I think it partly depend on whether there's anything that seems like it's time sensitive.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah,
I think
right.
we do it when we get a
Okay.
chance. to
Okay,
get it
that's
on.
We plan on something, if there's nothing immediate,
Yeah.
we'll do something towards the end of the summer.
Yeah.
But we'll leave it to you to flag whether or not there's anything that comes out of May 15th that impacts us, and we ought, at least ought to know about as we prepare to go for the next step.
Budget, you can just email us.
Yeah, I
send
was
to
just
me
saying,
and assign a
just
I
let us-
think as we do some of the studies though, and things start coming out of the study and reports start getting wrapped up, there may be some information that's relevant for us to be aware of as we then go into our formal.
And so, anybody else have anything they'd like to say? If not, I'd like to just take a moment. Jen, I believe this is the last time that we'll be with you as director. I want to express appreciation on behalf of the committee and also my personal appreciation for the great exemplary leadership that you've shown, really moving transit forward in the Commonwealth and through very challenging, difficult times. It's been a pleasure to work with you. I think at the level of professionalism that you and the staff have provided, it's just been something that has made our work much easier and really a great opportunity to, for me, certainly to learn a lot more about vital service for the citizens of the Commonwealth. So thank you very much for all that you've done.
Not one. Take note of that.
Is a motion for reconsideration in order?
You can do it.
He's got veto power.
It's probably got everything booked already.
I do. In fact, I have a lot booked for the summer. So I'm looking forward to spending some time with my kid this summer while he still wants to spend time with me and before he starts high school in the fall. But it has been a pleasure. I think when I jumped into this in June of 2016, I didn't know a whole lot about transit, but I think between the Revenue Advisory Board we had going and TSDAC, it was trial by fire. But I'm so proud of this team. I think back to the early work that we early in my tenure, we used a lot of consultants to do this technical work. And I can't say enough about the great people in this room and the level of technical competency and our abilities to do things here with that ownership and the really detailed knowledge about how these formulas work and how the processes work. I think it makes us just have a much better program. And so there's nothing wrong with consultants, love them too, but like these guys own our process and they do a fantastic job. And so I leave you in very talented and capable.
Don't be too far away. We have your cell number.
I will not be far and they all know how to conduct.
Yeah, and certainly want to echo those comments about staff. I remember well those meetings with the consultants where I felt like sometimes I had about 50 pounds worth of material on every possible scenario that was out there. And it's nice to be able to have somebody help navigate you through some of that. So very much appreciative of all of that great work. We will miss you very much.
Chair, I do want to echo your comments about Jem's good work and the staff. It is important that you all know the formulas, but you also know the systems in the transit, and consultants, as good as they are, they're going to come in, do their thing and leave. You guys live and breathe it. So thank you to the whole team and front leadership in going forward.
With that, anybody else have anything to say? I will not. I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.